Don't you dare sentence me. This is all a setup, and you know it.
Look closely at the man standing before the bench. Notice the $10,000 custom-tailored suit, the glistening Patek Philippe on his wrist, and that subtle, condescending smirk playing on his lips. This is Julian Vane, a man the media calls the Lion of Wall Street. For over 2 decades, Vane's signature had the power to change the fates of thousands, but more often than not, it was used to quietly bleed dry the pension funds of hardworking families. He believes that with a $2 billion net worth and a phalanx of the highest paid attorneys in New York, justice is just another commodity he can buy. He walks into this courtroom not as a defendant, but as a king expecting a tribute. He has no idea that today he is facing Judge Boyd, and in this room, his money is worthless. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B is heavy, a silence so thick it feels like lead. On the left side of the aisle, Julian Vane sits with his legs crossed, tapping his fingers on the mahogany table as if he's waiting for a boring board meeting to conclude. Beside him stand 3 elite lawyers, men who make a career out of twisting the law into knots to protect the guilty. But look behind them, to the gallery. There sit dozens of men and women with hollow eyes and calloused hands. These are the former shipyard workers who were discarded after Vane restructured their company into bankruptcy. They don't have designer suits. They only have their dignity and a fragile hope for something Julian Vane has long considered a joke: accountability. As I took the bench, I watched Julian Vane closely. While everyone else stood with respect, he rose slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing sloth that was a provocation in itself. Through the lens of human psychology, his body language screamed, "I am superior." He didn't look at the bench with respect. He looked at me as if he were trying to calculate the price of my integrity. He continued to chew a piece of gum, his jaw moving in a rhythmic, mocking motion. He glanced at his luxury watch twice in 60 seconds, signaling that his time was far more valuable than the lives he had shattered. In my world, these aren't just minor discourtesies. They are the physical map of a soul corrupted by absolute greed. I sat down and let the silence hang for 10 long seconds, staring directly into Julian Vane's eyes. Most men would flinch, but Vane only widened his smirk. I leaned forward, my voice low, but striking the room like a bell in a storm. I told him clearly, "Mr. Vane, in this courtroom, we do not measure a man's worth by his balance sheet. You will dispose of that gum, you will put away that phone, and you will learn to stand straight in the presence of the people you dismissed as statistical losses in your quarterly reports." A faint, scoffing laugh came from his lead attorney, but it was silenced instantly as I brought the gavel down with a bone-chilling crack. "This is your only warning. Your empire ends at that door. Here, you are just another man answering for his sins." The real battle had only just begun. Julian Vane's lead attorney, a man whose suit likely cost more than a worker's annual salary, stood up with a practiced air of confidence. He began to speak of economic restructuring, fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, and unavoidable market volatility. To him and to Vane, these were just words, a paper shield designed to deflect the blame for the destruction of 500 lives. But as the lawyer spoke, I didn't look at him. I looked at Julian Vane. He was leaning back, whispering something to his junior counsel and chuckling softly. That chuckle was the sound of a man who believed he was playing a game he had already won. He didn't see the people in the back of the room. He only saw obstacles in his path to a higher stock price. I turned my gaze to the first row of the gallery. There sat Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur is 68 years old. He worked at that shipyard for 40 years. His father worked there. His grandfather helped build it. When Julian Vane's company bought the yard, they promised innovation and growth. Instead, they stripped the assets, sold the equipment, and declared bankruptcy on the pension fund. Arthur didn't just lose his job. He lost the security he had earned through 4 decades of sweat and oil. I could see it in his eyes, not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. His shoulders were slumped, not from age, but from the weight of a betrayal he couldn't understand. Through the lens of human behavior, Arthur represented the pain point of an entire community, while Vane represented the pride that precedes a fall. The lawyer continued, his voice rising in a crescendo of legal jargon, attempting to bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork. My client followed every regulation, Your Honor. The bankruptcy was a strategic necessity to save the parent company. I held up a single hand, and the room went silent instantly. The air became heavy as I looked at Julian Vane, who finally stopped whispering. A strategic necessity? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room like a cold wind. Tell me, Mr. Vane, since you were the one who signed the orders, was it a strategic necessity to lock the gates on a Friday night without a single word to your men? Was it a strategic necessity to cancel the health insurance of a foreman undergoing chemotherapy just 3 days after the filing? Vane's smirk didn't vanish, but it faltered. He straightened his tie, a defensive gesture I've seen 1,000 times from men who think they are smarter than the law. He looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating, devoid of a shred of empathy. It's business, Judge. That's how the world works. You don't build a multi-billion-dollar empire by being sentimental, he replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. I leaned over the bench, bringing my face closer to his, staring into the soul of a man who had traded his humanity for a ledger. In the world of Wall Street, perhaps, but in this courtroom, Julian, the world works on the principle that you are responsible for the wreckage you leave behind. You speak of market volatility, while these families speak of hunger. You speak of shareholders, while Arthur Penhaligon speaks of medicine he can no longer afford. Today, your business is on trial, and the currency here is not gold, it is justice. The courtroom held its collective breath as the prosecutor approached the bench, carrying a single, weathered blue folder. This wasn't just paper. It was a record of every lie Julian Vane had told over the last 12 months. As the folder was opened, I watched Vane's face. For the first time, his arrogant mask slipped. His eyes darted to his lead attorney, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated fear. In the world of power, information is the only currency that matters more than money, and Julian Vane realized, in that heartbeat, that he was bankrupt. His lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting about proprietary information and unauthorized leaks, but I silenced him with a single look. In this room, the truth is never unauthorized. Inside that folder was a series of internal emails sent from Vane's private server just days before the bankruptcy filing. While Julian was on national television claiming that the shipyard had run out of cash, he was privately authorizing a $40 million transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was a memo titled Benefit Mitigation. In it, Vane personally approved the termination of the workers' long-term disability fund to pay for the operational costs of his private jet. He didn't just take their jobs. He took the money meant for their medicine, their surgeries, and their survival, all so he wouldn't have to fly commercial. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the evidence pressing down on the room like a physical force. I looked at Julian Vane, who was now frantically whispering to his lawyers, his face reddening with a mix of anger and desperation. Through the lens of human behavior, his lion persona was crumbling into that of a cornered predator. He looked at the victims in the gallery, not with remorse, but with a cold, predatory hatred. He blamed them for being there, for being the witnesses to his exposure. Mr. Vane, I said, my voice echoing through the chamber. I've seen many things in this courtroom, but the calculated cruelty in these emails is a new low. Even for a man of your reputation, Vane stood up, ignoring his lawyer's frantic attempts to pull him back down. That was a corporate decision, Judge. It was about the survival of the entity, he barked, his voice cracking for the first time. I didn't break eye contact. I let his words hang in the air, revealing them for exactly what they were. The excuses of a man who viewed human beings as disposable assets. The entity survived, Julian, I replied, but the men who built it are dying. You moved $40 million to the Caribbean, while Arthur Penhaligon had to sell his wedding ring to pay for his wife's inhaler. You didn't just break the law, you broke the fundamental contract of human decency. And today, the bill for that breach is finally coming due. Julian Vane's lead counsel, Kenneth Ashworth, sensed the walls closing in. He didn't look at the blue folder, he looked at me, his eyes searching for a crack in my resolve. He leaned in, whispering to Vane for a brief moment before standing with a smooth, oily grace. Your Honor, he began, his voice taking on a tone of fabricated conciliation. My client recognizes the administrative oversights that have occurred. In the interest of the community and to avoid a lengthy, painful trial for these workers, Vane Global is prepared to offer a global restitution package. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a bribe in a silk suit. $10 million, immediate cash payments to the pension fund, plus a $5 million donation to the city's healthcare initiative. All we ask is for a dismissal of the criminal charges in favor of a civil settlement. The room went deathly silent. $10 million. To the men and women in the gallery, that sounded like a fortune. I saw a few heads turn, a few eyes widen with a mix of shock and hope. But then I looked at Julian Vane. He was leaning back again, his confidence returning like a slow-acting poison. He adjusted his cufflinks and gave me a look that said, "Everyone has a price, Boyd. Name yours." He truly believed that a checkbook could erase the cold-blooded, calculated theft of 1,000 futures. Through the lens of moral philosophy, he wasn't offering restitution. He was attempting to purchase the court's integrity. He was treating justice like a hostile takeover. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't need to. I simply leaned forward, my shadow falling over Julian Vane. "Mr. Ashworth," I said, my voice echoing with a coldness that made the court reporter pause. "Let me be very clear so there is no misunderstanding in the record. Are you offering me money to modify the course of criminal justice?" Ashworth turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "No, Your Honor. It's a settlement." I cut him off, the sound of my voice cutting through his lies like a blade. "It is an insult. You are standing in a temple of the law, offering a down payment on a crime. You think that because you have millions in a Caribbean account, you can buy the right to destroy lives and walk away with a clean record." I turned my eyes to Julian Vane. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a look of sheer, arrogant disbelief. "Julian," I said, dropping the formal titles, "you spent 20 years convinced that everything in this world is for sale. You thought Arthur Penhaligon's dignity was for sale. You thought the health of your employees was a line item you could delete. And now, you think my conscience has a price tag." I stood up, towering over the bench, the power of the law radiating from every word. "Keep your money. You're going to need it for your defense, because this court is not for sale. In this room, the only thing that matters is the weight of your sins, and that is a debt you cannot pay with a wire transfer. You aren't leaving this room with a settlement, you're leaving it with a reckoning." Julian Vane moved toward the witness stand with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who still believed he owned the room. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed his hair, and sat down, carefully arranging his features into a mask of solemn concern. But as an expert in human behavior, I saw the truth written in the tension of his jaw and the cold, darting movement of his eyes. He wasn't there to tell the truth. He was there to perform. He began his testimony not by answering questions, but by delivering a pre-written speech about his legacy, the thousands of jobs he claimed to have created, and the difficult choices a leader must make for the greater good of the economy. To him, the lives he had ruined were just collateral damage in his grand vision of success. I watched the gallery as Julian spoke. I saw Mrs. Gable, the widow of a foreman who had worked under Vane for 30 years. Her husband had passed away just weeks after his health insurance was cut, unable to afford the specialized care he needed. She sat there, her hands trembling, clutching a faded photograph of a man who had died because a CEO wanted a larger year-end bonus. Julian Vane didn't even look at her. To him, she was invisible, a ghost from a boardroom meeting he had long since forgotten. He kept talking about synergy and market competitiveness, using corporate jargon to sanitize the blood on his hands. It was a masterclass in sociopathic detachment, a man so disconnected from humanity that he genuinely believed his own lies. I leaned forward, interrupting his rehearsed monologue. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice cutting through his polished rhetoric like a serrated blade. "You talk a lot about the greater good and economic survival, but let's look at a specific example of your leadership. In June of last year, while you were finalizing the offshore transfer we discussed, you received a personal plea from the shipyard safety inspector regarding the failing ventilation systems. He told you, in writing, that men were getting sick. Your response, which is now part of the record, was, and I quote, The cost of repair exceeds the projected loss of productivity from sick leave. Denied. End quote. The room went silent. The Lion of Wall Street suddenly looked very small under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Julian tried to recover, his face flushing a deep, angry red. That was a calculated risk assessment, Your Honor. You can't run a global empire based on emotions. He spat, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain his dominance. I didn't back down. I held his gaze until he was the one to look away. A risk assessment? I repeated, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You risk their lungs to protect your profit margin. You risk their lives to buy a second vacation home in Aspen. You didn't just manage a company, Julian. You farmed human suffering for your own luxury. You think your corporate title gives you the right to play God with the lives of these people. But today, you're just another defendant who ran out of excuses. The ghosts of your boardroom are here today, and they are demanding an answer that your money can no longer provide. Julian Vane's face had transformed. The deep, composed tan of a billionaire who spent his weekends in the Hamptons had turned into a sickly, gray pallor. He wasn't the lion anymore. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals lash out. He began to shout at the prosecutor, accusing the former employees of conspiring against him, claiming that the blue folder was filled with forged documents planted by disgruntled subordinates who were too lazy to adapt to the modern economy. He turned his vitriol toward the gallery, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur Penhaligon. You were lucky to have a job at all, Vane bellowed, his voice echoing with a hollow, desperate rage. I kept that shipyard on life support for years, while you people drained it dry with your demands for fair wages and safety. The room was stunned by the sheer, naked contempt in his voice. It was the death throes of an ego. As a student of human psychology, I recognized the pattern. When a man like Vane can no longer hide behind his money, he tries to destroy the reality of everyone else. He was attempting to gaslight an entire community, to make them believe that their suffering was their own fault. But I didn't move. I let him speak. I let the jury and the world see exactly who Julian Vane was when the champagne stopped flowing and the board of directors stopped applauding. He was a man who viewed human life as an overhead cost that needed to be eliminated. His lead attorney, Kenneth Ashworth, was frantically trying to signal for a recess, sensing that his client was committing legal suicide on the stand. But I denied the request. I wanted every word of Vane's arrogance recorded in the transcripts of history. I turned to the prosecution and signaled for their final witness. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in a sharp, conservative suit walked in. Julian Vane stopped shouting mid-sentence. His jaw dropped, and he slumped back into the witness chair as if he had been struck. The man walking toward the stand was Marcus Thorne, the former chief financial officer of Vane Global, and Julian's closest confidant for 15 years. Marcus Thorne didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to the stand, took the oath, and began to speak with the calm, clinical precision of an executioner. He described the dark meetings, late-night sessions where Julian would laugh as they found new ways to hide pension money in offshore shells. He told the court how Julian had a private betting pool with other executives on how long it would take for the union to break after their insurance was cut. Julian didn't do it because he had to, Thorne said, his voice quiet but devastating. He did it because he enjoyed the feeling of being the only one who survived. I looked at Julian Vane, whose eyes were now wide with a terrifying realization. He had built a fortress of lies, but he had forgotten that even fortresses have traitors when the foundation is built on greed. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was already here. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's testimony was not just a lack of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. Julian Vane sat in the witness chair, his body trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable shiver. The man who had entered this courtroom believing he was a god among men now looked like a ghost haunting his own trial. His expensive suit seemed too large for him now, as if the arrogance that had filled it out had finally evaporated. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see defiance. I saw the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized that his $40 million offshore fortress had no walls high enough to keep out the light of justice. I stood up slowly, the rustle of my robes sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. I walked to the edge of the bench and looked down at him, not with anger, but with a profound, clinical pity. Julian, I began, my voice steady and cold. You spent your entire life studying the art of the deal. You learned how to manipulate markets, how to leverage debt, and how to hide the truth behind layers of corporate shell companies. You were a master of the what you could own, what you could take, what you could buy. But in your obsession with the what, you completely forgot the who. You forgot that behind every decimal point you deleted, there was a man like Arthur Penhaligon. Behind every operational saving you authorized, there was a widow like Mrs. Gable. I picked up a single sheet of paper from the blue folder, the record of the final betting pool Julian had shared with his executives. You placed a wager, Julian. You bet $10,000 that the union would break within 3 months of losing their health care. You turned the survival of 500 families into a parlor game for your own amusement. I let the paper flutter from my hand, landing on the floor near Vane's feet like a piece of trash. Through the lens of human decency, you are the poorest man I have ever seen in this courtroom. You have a mountain of gold and not a single ounce of honor to go with it. You thought your corporate power put you above the law, but the law is not a line on a spreadsheet. It is a living, breathing promise that the small will be protected from the predatory. Vane tried to speak, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He looked toward his team of lawyers, but they were already packing their briefcases, their eyes averted. They were sharks, and they knew when there was no more blood to be squeezed from the stone. Julian Vane was alone, truly, utterly alone. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like thunder. You aren't just losing your company today, Julian. You are losing the myth you built for yourself. You aren't a lion. You aren't a leader. You are just a man who stole from the people who trusted him, and today the universe has come to collect the interest on that debt. Stand up, Mr. Vane. It's time to face the people you tried to erase. The time for words has ended. The air in the courtroom is so still, it feels as though the world itself has stopped to witness this moment. I looked down at Julian Vane. He was standing now, but his legs seemed barely able to support the weight of his own existence. The 3 lawyers beside him, once so confident and sharp, stood with their heads bowed, already distancing themselves from the sinking ship of Vane Global. Julian looked toward the back of the room one last time, perhaps searching for a friendly face, a loyal ally, or a way out, but he found only the steady, unwavering gaze of the men and women he had called statistical losses. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were the jury of his conscience. I picked up the gavel. Its weight felt significant, a physical manifestation of the thousands of lives hanging in the balance. Julian Vane, I began, my voice ringing out with the clarity of a bell in the morning air. You came into this court believing that your wealth made you a sovereign, that you could dictate the terms of your own accountability. You were wrong. You didn't just violate the law, you declared war on the very idea of the American dream, the promise that if you work hard and play by the rules, you will be protected. You took that promise and you burned it to fuel your own vanity. You didn't just steal $40 million. You stole the peace of mind of every person in this room. I looked at Arthur Penhaligon, who was now standing straight, his eyes clear for the first time in years. This court finds you guilty on all counts of corporate fraud, grand larceny, and criminal negligence. I am sentencing you to 35 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate and total forfeiture of every asset held in your name, including your offshore accounts, your properties, and your private fleet. Every cent of that $2 billion empire will be placed into a court-supervised trust. That money will not go to the government. It will go back to the shipyard workers, to the pension fund you emptied, and to the families of the men who died because you deemed their lives too expensive to protect. The room erupted not with shouts, but with a collective gasp of relief that turned into a low, somber murmur of justice. Julian Vane collapsed back into his chair, the sound of the gavel hitting the bench, echoing like a thunderclap that finally cleared the air. Arthur, I said, looking directly at the old man in the front row, your pension is restored. Your dignity was never lost, only overlooked. As for you, Mr. Vane, you once said that the world doesn't run on sentiment. Perhaps not, but today, you learned that it runs on justice. And justice, unlike your company, can never be liquidated. Bailiff, take him away. This court is adjourned. As the officers led the lion out in handcuffs, he didn't look like a king. He looked like exactly what he was, a thief who had finally run out of time.